Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, folks. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Marketing Your Practice podcast, the podcast where I get to simplify the marketing and the mindset so you, the chiropractor, can increase your income, your impact, and your enjoyment in practice too. It's book review time again. Martin Harvey and Tony Croak are back on the podcast, and this month we're discussing a book called The Art of Insubordination, How to Dissent and Defy Effectively, written by Todd Kashdan. Now, I gotta admit, I was sold with the title. I like the idea of being an insubordinate. Now, this book is perfect for any chiropractor who is on a mission to change the world, or maybe even on a mission just to change their local community. As most chiropractors who've been in practice for more than just a moment, you've probably experienced just how difficult it is to get people to change their habits and their belief systems. It's flat out not easy. Now, this book will provide a roadmap for you that will make that journey, importantly, easier, but even more important than that, it'll make it a whole bunch more effective as well. The author shares 5 essential principles that rebels can use to maximize their persuasive potential of their message. Now, I love these, and I think you're going to really love these also. It's a great book. It brought together a whole bunch of messaging and behavior change formats and frameworks in a way that I found really valuable, and hopefully you will too. I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks again for all that you do. Keep saving lives. See you soon.
So this is our book club discussion. This time the book is The Art of Insubordination, How to Dissent and Defy Effectively by Todd Kashdan Ph.D.
Yeah, so, good title. Good title.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things that appeals to the inner rebel. You feel like, you should be getting a few neck tattoos, a few big silver rings, and getting put some Rage Against the Machine on in the background and go for it. But yeah. I'm sort of impressed by Croakey's form of insubordination, where he's so insubordinate that he hasn't turned up for our discussion of our book club book, even though I know full well he's read it. So yes, next level.
Well, this was his recommendation of the book, and we were communicating with him this morning about it, and now he's decided, yes, absolutely, I'm just not going to turn up to book club to chat through it. I got to admit, I was as I started to read into this book within the first chapter, I was kind of as excited as I'd been in a long time about a book and the concept of it. It makes sense that it's so relevant to us as chiropractors, in that we have a message that we want to share that is outside the norm. He kind of starts off with that example talking about Charles Darwin and his idea of evolution, and spoke about kind of prior, and I didn't realize the number of people beforehand that had spoken and put forward theories of evolution. I mean, Charles Darwin was not the first by a long way. Like, that was right back kind of, did I remember ancient Egypt or something kind of wacky?
Yeah, there was certainly a long prehistory of the idea, but I think it sort of ran into that idea that because it almost is a critique of God's omniscience, that it's sort of the religious authorities of the day would quash any heretical thoughts of evolution, that something happened outside God's purview. So yeah, really interesting in terms of that parallel with chiropractic, where there is a received wisdom about where health comes from and what you should do if you want to maintain or improve your health, and there is almost like a heretical aspect, particularly, the current circumstances with the pandemic, where questioning anything to do with that mainstream narrative is tantamount to blasphemy. It's sort of interesting to see this. But one of the things that I loved in that sense, though, was that I made the joke about putting on Rage Against the Machine. He's very much advocating when he talks about oh God, what's the term that he uses? But to be actually a really was it
a conscious rebel, or
yes, that's the word I'm looking for. So that you basically need that there's an ethics associated with it, that mean that just raging and being nasty to people because they have a different belief system and all those sort of things is not the ethical way to do it, but it's also, as he goes through the book, not the most effective way of impacting things either.
Yeah, so he had a nice differentiator with regards to that. I think, because I was thinking about in particular this morning, knowing that we're chatting, And I like to kind of, now that I know that one of the great things about these discussions that we have is I now look at a book and I go, what will I do different?
Yeah.
And without sounding arrogant, I don't know that there were many things in there I'm like, oh man, I'm not really, but it was just, it seemed to bring a lot of things together.
I would agree.
Under an umbrella and so I enjoyed it. It wasn't like my experience of Leaders Eat Last, our Simon Sinek, which I'm just going to take the opportunity again to just lay the boots in.
Just sink the boot in, yes.
Let's not have one of those. Like that fucker, man, how dare he?
Yeah.
So
yes,
we will continue to give that a rogering every time we do one of these. Where I was like, man, I'm ready for this to finish. Like, will you hurry up and get through your quota? I didn't feel like that at all through the book. Interestingly enough, I enjoyed it. I was looking at it a lot through the lens of trying to understand what had happened through the pandemic. And, there was a couple of interesting things inside of there, one of which I'm going to have to try and remember. There's so many lovely frameworks in the book that I liked in amongst it too there. But in some ways, there was part of me thinking that because of the pandemic, maybe this was an opportunity for people to change their ways of thinking. But he actually put forward a lot of evidence that said that during times of stress like this and unease, it's actually the times that we're less likely to want to do that. I think he kind of talked about was it George Bush that had an approval rating of 51%, and then a moment after the September 11 bombing, all of a sudden he was at all-time high 90% there too. People rallied behind him.
I think it sort of taps into one of those key ideas connected to what you're talking about, where he talks a lot about the status quo bias, which I've spoken about before in a communication context. But I think I guess sort of big picture, share your sort of sense of, there was a lot of stuff that I was aware of, but he put in a framework which made me see it from a slightly different perspective. And one of those things was the status quo bias. And he spoke quite a lot about how there were sort of 4 reasons why you tend to prefer the status quo. And a couple of them were that idea that, there's a safety in the familiarity of keeping things the way that they are. So looking at people, who have run their health in a medical sort of way, there's a safety in that sense of, well, I know what the outcomes are here. It might not be optimal, but at least it could be worse. And I found one of the things that he said in that regard really, really interesting, which was that often the people who are least well served by a belief system also believe in the status quo bias, because there's this sort of hope for a better future that we have, where people somehow miraculously think that something's going to get better in the future. And to me, the things that sprung to mind were the appeal of, the mainstream news services, Channel 7, Channel 9, whatever, how they often have at the end that sort of human interest piece will be some new medical breakthrough that's coming around, a pill that can make you slim, the magic bullet that's going to get rid of multiple sclerosis, like all this stuff that you sort of look at and you go, well, that just doesn't seem, most of them don't seem to turn out to anything, but there's a mass appeal to this idea that if we just stick with this paradigm, just around the corner are the next wave of penicillin-like miracles where it suddenly changes the landscape in which we live. So I thought that was sort of interesting in terms of a communications context. It certainly speaks to the experience that I've had, that some of the sickest people that I've seen, where my interpretation through my paradigm of more sort of natural, vitalistic, humanistic viewpoint of health, look at people who have just had this cascade of shitty outcomes with the medical system, are often the ones who are the most true believers that they just haven't found the right doctor, the right surgeon, the right drug to solve their problems. And I thought, it's sort of interesting that there's that piece to it.
Yes. Yeah. One of the things I think I enjoyed about the book is there are smatterings of fascinating social science research in there. And you talking about that, in societies of, the underprivileged, those that are being harmed most by the system are often those that love it too. So I found that, really fascinating. So along with you also. So,
well, it's sort of interesting in that, I think it's always bad to talk about politics in an environment where, you could have an audience of people who'll be offended by whatever you say. And particularly talking about the politics of another country is, in many ways, potentially the most dangerous one. But I found it interesting that, that you look at the people who voted for Trump, that there was a huge number of people who were, essentially the working poor in the US. A lot of them were voting for Trump, where you look at his they were engaged by his aspirational message of, if we make America great again and we just work harder, this can be a great country for you, where in a lot of ways, I think it's quite likely that they were not well served by Trump's policies, putting a big caveat around there that I'm not in America and I'm no expert in politics, but
I'm not even.
I just don't want to get angry messages going, are you some sort of Democrat blue boy? Well, I don't care.
Yes. Well, let's, because he had his 5 essential principles rebels can use to maximize the persuasive potential of their message. Shall we talk through those?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. So principle number 1, work it from the inside. Just there is a tendency, and I can see for us and myself to want to polarize an us versus them type sort of scenario. And when piggybacking on the back of people liking the status quo, that immediately kind of puts me outside the status quo, and so is already a barrier to people wanting to listen to me. And so I saw a shift in that with my communication. In the early days, I really positioned the traditional healthcare as the evil empire, and I would go into any talking about, here's the fatalities, here's the this, here's the that. And I would really take this polarizing position against it, which I don't know what one, and I would do like a weekly healthcare talk, but at one of those, I kind of stopped at some stage and I said, look, raise your hand if you have either directly feel that medicine, traditional healthcare has saved your life, or if you know somebody close to you, family member, kind of direct contact, that it's saved their life. And everybody raised their hand. And at that moment there, I had a very interesting I'm talking to a bunch of people here who feel that either them themselves or somebody very close to them has had their life saved by medicine. And I'm like, I'm about to try and tell them how bad it is. I'm like, this is not going to work for me at all. And then I switched into that from then on to saying, here's where medicine is great. Many of you have probably had your life or someone's close to your life saved by it. And it's incredibly strong in these areas through here. And here's its downfalls. And it was so much easier for me to say, and it was so much easier received when I didn't position it us versus them. I could acknowledge what it was great for. Is that your take on?
It's actually interesting you put it in that way, because I sort of had a similar take from it, I had a similar evolution as well, going through my early sort of chiropractic arsehole era of being very strident about what health was and the only path to it and all that sort of stuff. But sort of connected to it from a communication structure perspective, we often think that people, we have this curse of knowledge, where once we have a particular type of knowledge, or we have a high level of understanding of an area, we can't really empathize with what it might be to not have that perspective. And so the follow on from that is that when we're talking to people who, we have this really highly nuanced perspective around a natural health philosophy, and other people won't necessarily have that. So we're saying our message that aligns with our belief systems and it has a particular meaning that they don't necessarily have. The second piece to that is when you make people wrong for their beliefs, the natural response to that is to reject what you're saying, to ignore it, or to evoke sort of motivated reasoning, or where we're essentially finding all the reasons we were right to have our belief system in the first place. So it's a really ineffective way of changing people's beliefs. And the third piece that you came to there's a communication approach that I teach called yes and, which essentially says that actually, rather than getting people, particularly if they don't have a really hardwired, thought out perspective on something, you don't have to convince them they're wrong. You just have to really open up a sort of sense of curiosity for them. And he speaks about it in a different context later on. But essentially, if you create a sense of curiosity or interest with them by saying medicine is great at blah, 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 and if you went to your medical doctor and you were like, all right, doc, I'm feeling great. What have you got for me? What's the path forward in terms of unfolding this vitality? What are they going to tell you? What pill are they going to suggest? What surgery are they going to suggest? They don't really, it's not part of their focus. And that's really where we come in. And so it's a way of sort of agreeing with their current behaviors and saying, yeah, it's great that you've used medicine to save your life. And it's great that you have this backup system if shit goes really south. And there's this neglected area that you might not have even really thought about in terms of what you could be doing proactively for your health to help you do the things that you love to do more, or do them at a higher level. So yeah, I thought, and the other thing that spoke to me in terms of that, start from the inside, was that idea of, we sometimes want to try and convince people who are on the opposite spectrum from us, where I sort of actually think there's a whole lot of people who are super adjacent to your existing belief systems that are much more available to it. And so, like, speaking to them, like focusing your efforts on getting people who are already doing yoga, who are already going to the gym, who are already interested in eating well, and they just haven't put the piece of the puzzle through to all of those things that help your body feel and function better. Yeah, you've got this other lens that you could, or this other tool that you could use called chiropractic to help you do life better.
Where do you think this fits in? Because the one thing that was going on in the back of my mind was the concept of polarity that's often talked about, that in order, and sometimes the metaphor is given like a magnet. The more attractive a magnet is at one end, the more repulsive it is at the other end. And so that line in the sand, here's what I'm for, here's what I'm against there too. And where do you think it fits in with that kind of idea?
Yeah. So look, it's an interesting tightrope to walk along, I think, in that if you're so bland and inoffensive to anybody, you're beige, and nobody gets excited about beige. And I think, look at, say, Seth Godin's idea of a purple cow. What the antidote to beigeness is remarkability. And in his marketing workshop, and also in his book, This Is Marketing, he sort of talks about this exercise that you do where you want to sort of be, if you can map, you imagine one of those graphs where you're going an X and a Y axis, and you've got 4 quadrants and all those sort of things. If you're looking at any 2 characteristics that a business could have in your market, you don't want to be in the middle where you're sort of okay at everything. You want to be as close to one of the edges in one of those quadrants as you can be. I think the distinction to me would be, you don't have to say the other quadrants are bullshit. You just have to go, we're way out on the edge here. So we're way out on the edge as far as proactivity for health and self-responsibility for health, or whatever those characteristics are. And you don't have to be as explicitly, and if you're wasting your time with reactivity and having somebody else take responsibility, you're a dickhead. That's where I think it's a little bit like that, the musical equivalent of, really angry stuff feels good at a certain time, but it kind of puts you in a bad mood as well as other people. So yeah.
Love it. So principle number 2, you kind of touched on before, which is really, I think, was spark their curiosity, not their fear.
Yeah.
And again, this is another thing that I have been hugely guilty about, of things being very fearfully driven. Again, same stories I talked about. These are the side effects. These are the, the deaths that come from here. It was very, and in some ways, the irony of it is that I was using the same motivational tactics to drive people away from medicine that medicine uses to keep them in it, this fear-driven in there. And certainly asking good questions was not something that, particularly in the early days, that I was very good at. I just love curiosity. I think, my belief system is that most healthy individuals, if you can ask them the right question, you can be patient enough. And you've talked about this a lot, that if I come to the answer myself, it's going to be much more powerful at staying there and creating a sustained behavior change than if you tell me how to do it. So again,
Yeah, no, I agree. I 100% agree. There was also, I listened to something else parallel with this that had made me look at this from almost the opposite perspective, where I think if we are being principled rebels, if we are being, wanting to make this positive change, and then, we're focusing on the people closest to us, I think it also pays us to realize that if we are looking at the other person as other, that it's harder for us to be able to influence them, but it also doesn't create a nice feeling for us. And so I heard this thing in this podcast where it was like, don't get furious, get curious. And so I thought, I like that. It feels right to me, because it speaks to that idea of when people are saying things that in some way I could interpret as invalidating my perspectives on things, rather than my immediate response being that defensive, no, here's why I'm right and why you're wrong, to sort of lean into the curiosity. And it sort of touched back to when we read the book a couple of years ago now, I think, The Thinking in Bets, where that idea of just being open to the idea that maybe you're wrong. What am I missing here? What else? And he speaks quite a lot to that idea of being aware that, you're not infallible, and connected to this curiosity piece. I look at it as, we want to evoke curiosity. We don't want to push back against their beliefs. We want to be asking them questions or pointing out things like, say one of the ways that I would use curiosity to break through that status quo bias and that expectation that, that idea that people who haven't had good outcomes think that there's better days ahead. And it's a really common held belief around health, is to just ask people a question where you go, so Angus, I'm sort of curious, the last 5 years, this is what's happened with your headaches, your migraines, and all these connected things. So over that 5 years, would you say things have been getting better, worse, or about the same? And let's say, like most people who have an unaddressed issue, it's got worse. The curiosity question that I've taken over the next bit is, I'll say, so if you were to project forward the way things have been going into another 2 to 5 years, how do you anticipate that would be? And in a lot of ways, I don't really care. And most people don't come back with a very specific answer, because they're thinking something highly abstract. But it connects, from my perspective, it connects a lot of people to that, I've got this magical thinking where things are in a particular direction, but I'm expecting them to all of a sudden reverse with no real reason for that. Yes. But it's by asking them in a way that they've got to do this thought exercise that's based on a little bit of a curious of, wow, that would be. But it helps then, from my perspective, they're more open to a different solution, because they've had that curiosity of, maybe this isn't an outcome that I really want to have.
This was one, again, that if we go back to the pandemic, and I guess, because the entire motivation for behavior change through that was heavily fear-driven.
Yeah.
Now, was that just successful because it was coming from the status quo? Or was, because fear clearly is a motivator,
Yeah.
And that basic kind of motivational triad of move away from pain, move towards pleasure, decrease kind of energy seems very fundamental there. So where does, this was one for me, I'm like, where does it fit in? Because it clearly works.
Well, I think fear, my take on it was fear makes you more likely to behave according to the status quo. So fear is a motivator. So, Kahneman would say broadly that we're 4 times more likely to act in a way that gets us away from what we don't want, to avoid an unwanted outcome, than we are towards doing something better.
Yes.
However, when we're stressed and or worried or whatever, you're much more likely to go with the one where the potential upsides, even though they might not be that great.
Yeah.
But more importantly, how bad the downsides. So you look at the scenario of people taking antibiotics when they have an ear infection, say. Part of that is fear-driven of look, I feel uncomfortable now, but this could get worse and I could lose my hearing and I could do blah, 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 blah. And look, I've heard all that stuff about maybe antibiotics aren't that good for me in the longer term and disturbs my gut biome and isn't good for the planet and all that sort of stuff. But, look, would one prescription really make that much of a difference? I'll just do it this one time, as opposed to a different sort of view of it, looking at it through a different sort of more naturalistic lens, where you may not be as aware of you're not as assured of avoiding that negative outcome.
So, my take on it was, once you're already drinking the Kool-Aid, fear is a good way to keep somebody drinking it, but it might not be the best way to get somebody drinking it in the first place. Is that your kind of take on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So principle number 3 was project an aura of objectivity. No rocket science here, but when you can kind of, support your argument with data, research is great. That tends to bring a level of authority, expertise. That there, I don't think that there was anything, speaking less about your opinions and speaking more about the opinions of the held authorities. And again, I think that to our listeners there, to make sure, particularly for us, I think both, 1, online trust is at an all-time low, and 2, as allied healthcare practitioners, alternate, whatever word you want to use, chiropractors, there too, then as sad as it is, I think we'd have to admit the trust isn't where it ought to be. No. And so adding in levels of objectivity where it's not your thoughts and opinions, but you can substantiate it with good external references just makes sense. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, look, it's one thing that it sort of taps into there. There's a lot of discussion in a lot of these sort of influence literature books around this paradox or dichotomy around communication. And I tease it out, and I actually think there's 2 parts to it that intersect in this discussion. The first one is in this interplay of emotion and rationality in decision making. And so there's a lot of different authors who speak about it in different ways. Probably the most well-known is Daniel Kahneman, who talks about system 1 and system 2 thinking. Other authors call it different names, but essentially we have 2 types of thinking. We have fast, intuitive thinking, like our gut feel around things, of that I just don't trust that guy, I don't want to do that, or that sounds too good to be true, I don't think I want to do that. And then there's more slow analytical thinking, which is the type of thinking that we do where we use a spreadsheet to break down and look at things. And we're sort of wired to use as little energy as we can to make decisions, given that we've got hundreds, thousands of decisions to make. And so most of our decisions are made just with that sort of gut feel. That seems about right. Yes. And interestingly, when you really deconstruct the research in this area, you can, even if you want to use detailed analysis, you still have the impact of that gut feel perspective. So if we look at this, sometimes people look at that and go, well, all I have to do is give people an emotional reason to do something, and then I don't need to provide any facts or any rationale or create any sense of authority. But what that doesn't take into account is that part of what people use to decide whether they trust you or not is whether you are, they know culturally that science is the language of authority. And so they can almost be emotionally reassured by you saying the research suggests that this is a good approach, that chiropractic is a good approach in this area. The second paradox that it ties into from a communication perspective is often people think that if you're trying to influence or persuade somebody, that you need to do almost that, I've got to handle your objections and I've got to push you and I've got to ring you up and go, are you going to decide? Look, here's sign on the dotted line. You do it now or you don't do it at all. These kind of badgering techniques. And interestingly, the paradox is that most of the research says the opposite is true, that if we take an approach of people buy you before they buy your message. So, and one of the filters that they use is, does this guy seem authoritative in this area or not? And using that language of, look, the data here is, but also it's that language of restraint. It's not like an emphatic, chiropractic's great for everybody and there's never any bad outcomes and we can help regardless of whether you've got multiple sclerosis or a sore back. That doesn't seem like a credible message. Whereas what I read into it is, you need to, people don't use fear, use curiosity and meet people's emotional needs, and then make sure that you've got some data to back it up, because that will help reassure them.
Yeah. There is this drive. I feel like we love an either or, like it's this way or that way. When I think you kind of started off, more cases than not, my experience is this: it's a both and. Like there's no one to say that you need to just use any of these. Talk to the emotional brain, talk to the logical brain. Someone go, well, it's all about the emotional brain. Is the rider on the elephant? Whose analogy is that? That's, I
think that's is that down in Chip Heath's, I think. Oh no, is it Jonah Burgett's? I can't remember. One of those guys.
In terms of who's making the decision, where the logic is the rider on the elephant. And we might say, hey, listen, I actually don't want to have the Mars bar, but if the elephant wants to have the Mars bar, then good luck stopping it there too. So speaking of Mars bars, so he's decided to grace us with his presence. Dr. Tony Croak, welcome.
Just an absolute shambles. Sorry, guys.
No stress. We were just, if you listen back to the recording, you'll see that the first part of us is wondering whether we missed the chapter on being a principled insubordinate meant you make a meeting, suggest the book, and then don't turn up. And we're like, well, is this the ultimate insubordinate act?
I was virtuously riding up Mount Macedon when I missed your call, thinking I'll be back in time to actually have clothes on for this one. And here I am, exactly 1 hour late.
Well, welcome. It's good to see you. We're chatting through the 5 essential principles that rebels can use. We're up to number 4, project courageous self-sacrifice. I like this one. There was, I guess it shows the level of vulnerability, authenticity for us to, there's the idea being that there's a level of, we're constantly, when somebody's wanting to convince us of something, looking at them and saying, what's in it for them? Do they stand to make more money? Do they stand to get more fame? The two. And when, as us communicating it, when we can show the potential cost that it has to us, for us stepping outside of the norm there, and that this comes at financial risk, social risk, whatever there too, that the believability tends to kind of skyrocket. This was one that I don't know that I'd ever kind of really heard articulated like this. So it's like, oh yeah, it makes sense to me. I see people do it. At times I do it, not necessarily consciously, but Yeah, I like this. That was my any other kind of thoughts in around that with you guys at that point?
Because I've had a real case study in this in the recent weeks, because I've just started a gig at the Essendon Football Club, taking care of the players down there, and it's a real interesting example of going into a culture that's very different to what all of us would be used to in terms of it's pretty crisis oriented in terms of the management of their conditions or their injuries, and at the same time there is a mindset of preconditioning and making sure that these players are as fit and as resilient and durable as they can be. But there hasn't up until now been a space for chiropractic in that. And so I'm kind of going through this process of creating one, which is really interesting. And on this point, in terms of that portraying the cost to me, I think that it was something that I probably did without thinking about it. But I don't normally work in the practice at the times that I'm at Essendon, and I usually use that for downtime, admin, all the other stuff. And so when I got asked to consider this, I said, I could take it out of my downtime. I can put a bit of different focus to something new. It's a bit of a risk because, we don't quite know how the rest of the medical staff, I guess you call them, we'll take it, but let's give it a spin, and that was kind of well received. So yeah, I think that's, and like you, Angus, I think I've seen it done either consciously or unconsciously in the past, and it does add a layer of honesty and vulnerability. And
what does it look like in practice with a patient? That's what I've been kind of thinking about as well. Like, how do you bring this level of?
So to me, the thing that, if I can unpack it and then almost answer your question, one thing that I think it does where you say, look, this has been the cost for me in sort of advocating for this perspective, is that, it speaks to the point that we were talking about previously around people have a filter of, do I trust this person? And that idea of, look, if you must be a genuine person and this must be a really good thing if you're willing to sacrifice to advocate for it. That's sort of part of to me, the psychological reason of why this works as a way of giving a greater degree of credibility and impact to your message. In terms of how you talk about it, I would look at it a few different contexts. If you were talking to a group, I would look at it from that context of saying, look, I appreciate that you guys have given up your lunch hour to come along and hear me speak, and it's probably, I would probably, like you, prefer to be spending my time out, enjoying a beautiful lunch and a glass of wine and whatever else. The reason that I do it is because this idea is blah blah blah. It's an important thing for us, and so I would use it in that sort of context.
Great example.
I don't think you can use that same construct if you're talking to somebody early on in terms of a report of findings, all those sort of things. But where I think it does step in, where it does potentially have value, is to say, so look, what I need to do is map out for you what you need to do to get the goals that you've already indicated are important to you in terms of whatever symptomatic presentation brings most of the people that we see in. And I also, and it might be, not something that you're interested in. It might be something that, I'm talking past what you actually want, but I'm willing to have that discussion of mapping out some things that go further than where you might have already had an interest in, just because I think it could serve you really well.
Yep. Yeah, it was a concept that I really liked and do like, and I like the way that you articulated that, and I have been just searching for avenues for in practice, practical on the, I wonder sometimes when, if a patient was saying to me, if there was a long conversation, we were running a little bit late with regards to things too, I would often say to them, look, I'm happy to call you after hours tonight. Like I will stay back late there too, but this is important. I want to talk with you about this and we need to do a little bit deeper. I don't want to let people kind of be late for the rest of the afternoon. Let me take some of my private time at the end of the day and share it with you. I wondered if that was an example of them saying, look, here's the logic behind why I'm saying this. It's going to come at cost to me. It's not just the fact that I'm saying, I don't want to hear what you have to say. And I'm busy and you're not important. But yeah, I love it as a concept. I'm searching for practical applications to give to our audience in terms of here's how you, and you've given a couple of nice ones through there too. Any thoughts from you, Tony, at all in terms of where it fits in? I don't know that it has. I mean, it's five. Yeah. Anything else that you want to talk about with regard to principle 4, courageous self-sacrifice?
No, I think it probably fits a little bit in terms of the power of candor that, Martin, you talk about quite a bit. So that when we admit that that there are risks to us or to how we might be perceived by taking a certain stance, that transparency is often quite welcome.
Then principle number 5 was be flexibly consistent. Again, I like the feeling in around this idea of I'm in different thoughts of mine at the moment as I'm going through even different communications with Lauren and I at the moment, where there have been subtle disagreements about things. I'm having a dialogue with myself in terms of, is this the mountain I want to die on? We have values that we're heading towards, and it's like, it's not that important for me. There are some things that are important and there's some things that aren't. And finding those out and getting some clarity for me has been really great in terms of what are my expectations in amongst it too. And, because there is that tendency to be such tremendous dogma in certainly what we say, we as chiropractors, and we're often, suggesting that the other health professionals are doing that too. But I feel like, I have been as guilty of it as those that I've accused in the past as well. The tendency for me to want to feel the need to be right all the time is something, as I've aged, it's less there, other than perhaps on some of the basics. So again, just another good reminder of that it was for me.
One other thing that it spoke to me, which sort of bounces off what you're talking about in terms of that be flexibly consistent. One of the readings that I had of it was that if we want to be relevant to people, then we need to sort of at some level hold the line, but hold the line in quite a flexible way, if that makes sense. And so an application of that I would look at is, if we were talking earlier before Croaky deigned us with his presence about the idea of, early on in our careers being very, very kind of adamant about what health was and the only path that would truly bring you to it. And so if we had stuck to that, we were being consistent. We weren't being particularly flexibly consistent. And so I think the challenge then is when you lean into a more, look, I'm going to practice in a more patient-centered way, a client-centered way, where I'm going to listen to what your goals and values are and then give you what you want, and then, find a way to tell you what you could have as well. I think having structures that allow that consistency of still advocating for a higher level of health awareness. So, the communication framework that I would use is that pain prevention performance that allows people to still have a behavior of, I'm just using chiropractic for pain, but the consistency that I would, holding that flexible consistency is each time they return with a new episode, I'll say to them, look, you probably remember the framework that we talk about, the last time you were here, you used chiropractic in kind of a pain-based way, and completely cool if that's what you'd like to do again this time, just to map out what the path forward would be this time. This is what we'd need to do to get that pain part of the process started. If once things are sorted out, you want to take things further, then this is what we'd need to, this would be the broad sketch of what prevention and performance would look like moving forward. And to me, that is the way that I would look at a flexible consistency. Every time they're coming in, they're getting that consistent message. I don't sort of give up on people and say, oh, they're a pain-based person, so they come in with a reactivation. They only ever come in when they've had pain, so I'll only talk to them about that part of it, and I won't make recommendations or even offer them the potential for recommendations outside of that. I sort of feel like you lose that if we factor in things that we've spoken about that status quo bias and the fact that we're talking to people from a very different belief system from what they currently have. And there's big challenges around people changing their beliefs and therefore their behavior. I've got to be patient with that. And part of that is just committing to that flexible consistency.
Yeah. For me, this materialized in a story that I started telling myself, is that when people came in and saw me for chiropractic care, they were a patient for life, and sometimes they were active and sometimes they were inactive.
Yeah.
And I realized and so it just took all the pressure off me, all the judgment off me in terms of, in certainly the first 3 or 4 years, we were, again, if you and your crew didn't want to get checked once a week, that was fine. You just weren't a patient at my place. And as a result, I did a good job of building Roy Smith's practice by referring all these people to him, which he was very grateful for. So he'd have these wonderful families come into him and say, hey, listen, can we get checked once a month for the rest of our lives? And he'd be like, yes, absolutely. But it's interesting because that level of rigidity also came at a great expense to me as well. Like, the pressure that it put on me, holding on to the idea, it's like, here's my vision for what and how chiropractic can be used also, and I will stay consistent with that, but flexible in the fact that depending on what's going on for you and your family at this stage, it might look different from you from time to time. It meant that I didn't have to show up as the angry school teacher or, show up as their dad and scold them when they weren't behaving the way I wanted them to behave. It actually was a pivotal moment that made practice a lot more enjoyable for me. So, yeah. I like it. Tone, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when you've got a big enough story, then it is easier to be flexible and consistent at the same time. And as Martin was talking about, like, chiropractic works on that spectrum from pain to performance, and you can be just as consistent when saying, oh yeah, you got a pain, yeah, sure, like, let's check your spine, remove the interference, and we'll recheck and see how it's going. You want to prevent some injury, great, let's check your spine, remove the interference, and see if you want to perform better.
Yes.
And all across my career, it's been chiropractic is good for everybody all the time. And as you say, not everyone will choose that. And I've had higher or lower levels of indignance about people not choosing that.
Yes. Good word.
But in these days, cool, whatever. And then people, choose that along the spectrum, and that's cool too. And my message is always the same: chiropractic is good for everyone all the time. And it's not always the only thing. And in fact, rarely is it the only.
Totally.
Never is it the only thing that we want to do for our health.
Yes.
If we're honest. yeah, I think that when we hold gently to our principles and are willing to see where else other principles are just as relevant, then we don't come across as I don't know, Al Qaeda or someone.
Yeah,
You know?
I'm sure I have some form of confirmation bias, and I look for it now, which makes it even worse there too. But I have watched those peers around me that have been very inflexible in around the way they practice, the way they communicate with people, the way they accept people in and out of practice. It's often come at a great expense to them in some ways. It's almost like, for lack of a better term, the universe gives them a challenge. That the more flexible we are to, I think this is the way it should be, and I'm going to move forwards. Adaptability, flexibility is something that, I don't know, as I go on through life, I don't have more certainty in things. I feel like I actually have less certainty. Like I can remember, Martin, in the very early days, you and I were chatting about things, and we were talking about marriage, and you kind of said to me, like, look, I mean, obviously, if your partner has an affair, that's not a great thing, but, probably doesn't need to end a marriage. Like, they can move on past that too. And I was like, no, like there cannot be any other way. And yet now, like, I get to this stage now, and it's like, well, relationships are complex. There's lots of factors involved in them, and who would know? And unless I was in that situation to be able to look at it. And so, I feel like the more flexibility I have in my life, the better my life is, as a general
It's
rule.
interesting. There's a whole section in the book where he talks about, if you are going to be an insubordinate, if you're going to advocate for important but not the status quo ideas, that you need to have a proactive strategy of maintaining your own resilience. And the core of it that he talks about is that effective principled rebels have psychological flexibility, and then he gives a bunch of very specific strategies around it, which I think speaks to that idea that if you have very narrow rules about what things mean, if you're wanting to go into something that you're going to be running into people who have differing beliefs, if it has to go a certain way, that's pretty exhausting. Given that the majority of the time you're not going to expect people. And I remember hearing a quote years and years ago that if you can't at the same time hold that an idea is revolutionary and that people are going to agree to it on the first round, that's not the way revolutions work. So in particular, I thought some of his ideas around psychological flexibility were super, super valuable. And one of them, if I can sort of highlight it, that I thought was really cool, was this idea of, if you're in a situation, and it sort of speaks to that idea that we were talking about it earlier, that if something's really confronting to you or your belief system, somebody's saying chiropractors are quacks, you're unscientific or whatever, that you could get furious about that, or you could get curious about it, or you could almost reframe it. And he spoke about these ideas of like describing it to yourself in the third person. So looking at it like, I can see Martin's getting, a bit, his heart rate's increased at somebody saying something that just doesn't happen to agree with the abstract notions that he has in his head about what his profession is. And, on the bigger global scale, he probably has lost perspective that there's people with way bigger problems than that. And, do you know what I mean? Like he was just describing, like, to separate yourself from that specific thing, to sort of almost zoom out and describe what's happening in a third person, was a really useful way of just diffusing the urgency, immediacy, and kind of meaning, or the size of the meaning that we tend to attribute to things when we are emotionally charged. So had a whole bunch of stuff around psychological flexibility as a tool for resilience, but I thought that was one of the ones that I thought, oh yeah, that's a really cool one.
To me, those 5 points of what is the recipe, so to speak, that we kind of just spoke to, and then his 4 points of psychological flexibility. That was the value of the book for me in those two kind of things there too. I like the simplicity of his. One of the things he talked about, that psychological flexibility, is get really clear about what your values are, and then make sure that you're acting in line with those two. And nothing new there too, but I did really like the questions that were asked in there too of, what would you rather go without, kind of, sleep, food. It was just nice ways of going, oh, well, that's a great way for me to clarify what my values are in around those things there too. It was a nice kind of side door entry and some clarity in around those. Shall I quickly kind of just state at least what those, I'll list all 4 of those steps there too, and then we can, what and who is important to me. Step 2 was what unwanted thoughts, feelings, memories, and bodily sensations am I experiencing? Get in touch with your discomfort. Step 3 was what am I doing to reduce, avoid, or control unwanted mental content? And then step 4 was what am I doing or could be doing to chase my values? He talks about gauging your opportunities there. And they were all the components of psychological flexibility, which that I found really helpful of, I think distancing yourself was an example of what you were doing before, Martin. That's what he was referring to it as.
Correct. Yes.
Taking a step back and talking about our problems from a third person, and sometimes just describing, what am I feeling? I sometimes go through a bit of a process with clients if they're fearful of doing something, making a video, for instance, I'll get them to really describe it. Like, what are you scared of? And when you're feeling scared, what does it feel like? Pain in my tummy, heart rate increases, feel a bit sweaty in the palms, all that kind of stuff there too. And then just going through that process, and it's like, is that it? Is that like, you're not going to die? No. Like, is anyone going to let this happen? No. And sometimes just breaking it down, I was interested that, that can often be a good way of just putting things in perspective as well. So, yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, I thought that was one of the more valuable pieces for me. I thought it was super interesting.
Yeah, and labeling emotions was another one that I found useful, because again, going back to this gig with the football club, I now report to the head physiotherapist, which is interesting. Yeah. So. And in one of the first conversations that we had before I'd even kind of got the gig, he was talking about the organizational chart in the club and how it works, and in that department particularly. And there was, the high performance manager, and then the doctors kind of off to one, the medical doctors off to one side, and then head physio, and then some other physios underneath that, and then the myotherapist, the podiatrist, and me. And and so I felt this wave of kind of and then I thought, okay, name that emotion. What is that? And I was doing the thing you were talking about, Martin. Tony's heart rate's elevating. His face is getting flushed when he's, and what's that emotion? And I'm like, that's my ego. It's just my ego going. I want to be up higher on the pyramid, And I was kind of amused by that, and it took all the power out of it for me. And then when you walk into the room with all these players, and they're all scrambling as to who wants to get on the table first, it doesn't matter, like where I sit on the org chart doesn't matter. It's a chance to have a play and give some service and have a fun hobby about doing a thing that I'm interested in, But if I'd held to that, if I hadn't recognized that emotion in myself, that reaction in myself, if I'd lived out of that, then I probably never would have walked in the door.
Yes.
So, and that happens less now, but it has certainly happened in practice over the years, where someone will say a thing and I react to their, as I perceived it, lack of understanding, disrespect for chiropractic. I've told you that already. Why didn't you do your exercises? All that stuff, you know. And if the less I act out of that kind of ego and need to be right, the better my life is. You know?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I liked, because in the book there too, there's a whole range of emotions that he just describes too. It's very interesting for me because, you know, I get hungry and tired. You know, I get stressed, sometimes anxious, horny. Like I got, it's 5 I can get to, like, and I went, it's like, there's the range of emotions that I have there. And I realized that that's not a great thing. Like maybe I could just expand out a little bit beyond some other things, and a bigger range would be helpful for me. It was another reminder of that. I have been trying over this. One of the things from John Demartini, we've kind of had conversations about this before, Tone, to some extent, that, you know, John Demartini would often look at any situation and then find out what's good about it, what's bad about it, and trying to get a balance on it there too. And so therefore, whenever a shitty event happened in my life or a shitty emotion came up, I would immediately try and see the silver lining in around it. Like that's where I would go for. Yep. And I would never feel the emotion, and I would certainly never process the emotion. I would resist the emotion. And I realized that I had someone describe it to me one time, that metaphorically what I was doing was pushing a beach ball down underneath the water. And the more beach balls that got pressed underneath the swimming pool, it was always fun when you were there with your mates to kind of step back and hopefully it would pop up and hit him in the face if you could kind of do it properly there too. But I realized that that would be, you know, there was a stage there a few years ago that this would just pop up as just rage and anger in me for no reason. Like and sometimes at myself, like I'd hit my head on the desk and I would be just angry at things there too. And I went, I need to start processing some of these emotions. I could see how kind of naming it, feeling it, breathing through it, stepping into it, as opposed to stepping away from it, has been very, very helpful for me over the years as well. That was another reminder of, I still got a long way to go when I looked at all of those emotions and realized that yeah, I went, what? Other ones. So
years ago, I did a job interview for to work in a bar when I was going through uni, and one of the questions was, tell us about all of the French champagnes you know. And I'm like, well, there's Dom Perignon and there's Moet Chandon, and pretty sure that's about it. And yeah, you got a similar understanding of emotions, Gus.
Yes. Yep, pretty much.
Well, at least he's got the top 2.
In psychology, they talk about the anger iceberg, that often, you know, we're not consciously aware of our emotions at any given moment, but every now and again they'll kind of come up out of the water, and often it's anger that's at the top. But what pushes it up, what supports that, what drives it out over the surface is embarrassment or shame or fear, or fatigue or hunger or
horniness. I think a lot of it is.
Is that, there's hangry, which is hungry and angry, but is there? I'm not sure how you mix horny and angry into it.
Hungry.
Watch out for that one. So, oh, crazy. So, where to next in the book? You know, after that sort of section there for me, it trailed off a little bit. I mean, I know there was other bits and pieces of, you know, the importance of surrounding yourself with people that would support you in your journey and how to choose all of those kind of people. You know, but there was not a lot after that, like I said, I wasn't in a hurry for it to end, but.
No, I guess the only other perspective that I probably teased out of it, and it kind of reiterated some of the stuff that we spoke about after thinking in bets, this idea that sometimes we're wrong, but we're highly wired to think we're right. So being aware that often we want to create an environment around us that allows people, that fosters insubordination, that there's a value in diversity of perspectives on things. And so, you know, in a chiropractic context, you've always done things this way. We've always answered the phone this way. We've always booked appointments this way. That's the way it is. It's very easy for that status quo to not really allow for innovation or growth or whatever, and to shout out voices that don't agree with the status quo, or just move on and ignore them in a team meeting context. And I think that, you know, that some of his steps that he was talking about in terms of making you know, what could we be missing here? What haven't we considered here? How might we, if we got to start this from scratch, how might we decide that we could do this if we weren't already doing it this way? That sort of thing of creating a structure where it's a safe place for people to have opinions, and that opinions that don't necessarily agree with the ones that you hold or that are held by the organization are actually really valuable for you to do it, particularly if you can distance yourself from, you know, that, well, look, just because you came up with that system, you don't have to feel like that sense of your ego being attacked, that somebody says, you know, that's kind of a shit way of doing it now that the world has moved on.
Yeah, I got a bit out of that, actually. It was just that section of the book about harnessing disobedience. I thought it was really a good reminder to go, instead of, so I know how this all works and let's see if we can fine tune it, rather have a mindset of curiosity and I think he talks about deliberate humility. Yeah. About you know, even if you don't necessarily at first glance feel humble a bit or uncertain about a way of doing things, it's okay to practice being humble and uncertain and see what pops up. You might end up coming back to, yeah, that's a pretty good way to do it. Or you might get a surprise, you know.
Yes.
And yeah, so I quite like that. And
I liked his word, anxious uncertainty, like to be able to hang out in anxious uncertainty. I thought that was a neat way to kind of describe it in amongst that.
Yeah. And that kind of recurring through the whole thing of being okay with not being okay, like that through the whole book. It's you know, if you're going to do this, the cost is that you'll be a bit uncomfortable. You know?
Yeah.
And you know, I've had 30 years where I practice in a place where I know where every pen is. I can open every door with my eyes closed and know where all the light switches are. In the last few weeks, I've been working in a noisy football club where I'm doing an initial consultation and building rapport with an individual while someone else hangs crap on them from the other side of the room. And it's a very, very different experience. And there's a lot of things I've had to let go of, a lot of things I've had to adapt. And if I had stuck to the way that I do it in my practice is the way that it's done, and that's it, then you'd go nowhere in an environment like that. So being okay with not understanding and not knowing, and you know, that's really important. I think when we want to embrace a new opportunity or learn a new thing or even refine the way we answer the phone, you know, it's.
I found this particularly challenging. You know, throughout the last years of COVID, I found it reassuring to come back to my chiropractic community where there was the same thoughts, the same narrative that was going on. And I was aware of the cost of that, yet to go back into that other environment, I had to kind of, in the early days, I was spending too much time. It was difficult, but you know, it's that the people that get their way to the head of policies and public health care and all this kind of stuff, they're too going back to thinking bets like, am I prepared to bet that I know better than them? Yeah. It's like, oh, geez, you know, when it comes down to it, you know, to hold that space. But it was very difficult to I was aware of the comfort that came from being in amongst my own there. And I was aware of the discomfort that kind of in that space as well. It was, it was very challenging, to stay open to something that is challenging from a philosophical point of view. So still lots of work to do in those kind of extreme scenarios for me.
I agree 100%.
That's a life's work, I think.
Yeah. So all in all, the book, a yay or a nay for you, Tone? Martin, was it a winner for you?
For me, it was really well timed because of this opportunity that came up.
Yeah.
And I think it gave me some good reminders about how to, and some new learnings about how to exist outside of my bubble that I've lived in. Like you say, it's really comfortable to be in a self-referencing chiropractic world. And it's really comforting to have everyone tell you that you're right all the time. But and we do our best in our practice to kind of try to reassess and re-examine. But there's been a limit to how much of a worldview I could have to compare myself to, because I do come from that chiropractic context, and so the book's been really good in terms of saying, okay, if you're going to take all the good stuff about chiropractic and put it into a foreign environment and have it survive and thrive, how would you go about that? And I found it really useful.
It's a good roadmap.
And it works really well in being reminded too that people don't come to us with a fully formed philosophy of their healthcare or awareness of their own decision making, and so it's just as useful on a day-to-day basis inside the practice to go, if I'm going to be an insubordinate in this person's world and take chiropractic and have it survive and thrive in their world, how do I go about doing that? And those principles work really smoothly, I think, in doing that too.
Yeah, I agree. Any final thoughts, Martin?
Yeah, no, it's probably very similar. I think it was it's probably not the easiest read. Like, it's not a difficult read, but it feels to me like maybe the structure of the way that the book didn't flow in the way that some other books have. And I think partly that is because he's come from an academic background, and this is one of those books that on that continuum of who moved my cheese on one end and maybe from good to great on the other end in terms of academic rigor, it's closer to good to great than who moved my cheese. So it's, which I think once you unpack it, and there's an upside to that in that there's more, to my mind, it's more reliably going to work because there is a higher level of absolute validity. It's not just ideas that he's come up with, it's based on quality research and the fields of psychology and a whole bunch of other things. So I wouldn't say it was the book that you go, wow, I'm just ripping through this, but there was a lot of value packed into it in terms of a framework of ideas that I already had an understanding of, and then a couple of really important nuances around that helped me look at things a bit differently in an area where I've been reading on for 25 years. So that's to me, a fairly high mountain to climb to add something quite unique and new. So it wasn't packed with, whoa, I'd never thought of it like that, but it did do a good job of, in a very sort of valid, understated way, put things in a useful context and framework.
Love it. My thoughts the same. I would recommend people read it if they're interested in this stuff.
Yeah.
So good work, gang. As
Excellent.
always, a tremendous pleasure chatting with you. Now, Tony, Martin and I decided for the next half hour, you're just going to sit on here by yourself and just stare at the screen.
Fair enough.
Well, I'm going to keep the recording going. I will come back and check later that you did it as well. So that'll be us being kind of insubordinate back at you. So, all right, dudes, look forward to chatting with you next time.
Love your work.
Thanks, guys.
If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come and check out my Community Influencer program. It's my monthly coaching program where we take all this material and I'll work with you to help you apply it, implement it, and systemize it. The Community Influencer Group Coaching Program is designed to help you increase your practice income, impact, and enjoyment. Join me over at anguspyke.com/join. That's anguspyke.com/join. I'd love to see you there.